Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi, Rickert, publisher and editor of Native News Online. Joining me today is our staff reporter, senior staff reporter, Jenna Kunze. Jenna, you have a very special guest. Jenna, tell us about who you have.
We do. Today we have Lee Brewer. Hi, Graham.
Hi.
And Graham is a national reporter covering Indigenous communities for NBC News. He's also recently the president of NAGPRA, the Native American Journalists Association, and he's a member of the Cherokee Nation. And Graham, as a fun fact, is also the first person to edit one of my stories that got me into this beat on Indigenous communities in Alaska for High Country News 3 years ago at this point, maybe plus.
Oh,
very nice. And congratulations, Graham, on that, becoming president of NAGPRA.
thank you. I appreciate that. I'm nervous and excited. So yeah.
Well, that's good. You'll do well. You will do well.
Thanks.
It's a good way to feel. Yeah, and also congrats, Graham, on this repatriation project that you've got going with ProPublica and NBC News in partnership. And maybe we can start by you just telling a little bit about how this project came about, how it was born in partnership with ProPublica, what it does, and what its lifespan is.
Sure. So ProPublica was working on this before I came along. And Mary Hudetz and I, who at ProPublica, Mary used to be the president of NAGPRA, and I know her through the organization and known her for a long time now. And we were kind of working in some of the same channels, working with some of the same sources, and making a lot of similar FOIA requests. And so when Mary kind of figured out that we were working on the same thing, she reached out and asked if I would be interested in partnering. And so that's kind of how that came together. I was really happy to do it because obviously ProPublica put a lot of thought and effort and resources into it. They built a whole team around it. And so that's kind of how we got started. God, that was, I guess, about a year or so ago, maybe longer. It's hard to remember now. But the project's really ambitious. And I think, for those of us who cover NAGPRA and are familiar with it, you know how murky that stuff can be, how it's like a lot of things in federal Indian law. It's really based on a patchwork of laws, or like an interpretation here is different than an interpretation there, or, and it doesn't really have a whole lot of teeth for enforcement. And so the result of that is that the publicly available data on repatriations, on what things remains and items that institutions still have is really like, there's really not a whole lot. The Park Service's database was so rudimentary that it really didn't even tell you, didn't really give you a lot on like tribal affiliation or just like the way these things came into the possession of these institutions. And so I think for the ProPublica side, that was a big motivating factor, was like, let's make this data as publicly accessible as possible, so that, of course, not only the public can understand this issue that this is an issue that I don't think most people who are non-native are really very aware of. And then the other thing is a lot of tribes, especially smaller ones that might not have a historic preservation office or the time and resources to look up this data, like now they have this place where they can go immediately look up and see like what institutions that receive federal funding have items or remains that may belong to them. And hopefully, I think the idea is to get that to help kind of speed along the process, or at least make it easier. And the project's data is going to be continually updated by ProPublica. And so I think since the reporting, some institutions will reach out and say, actually, the data that you have in your set doesn't match what we've done in the last few months, so we'd like to update it. And so I think that much like the database they did with like nonprofit spending and salaries, it's kind of like, hopefully will provide this space that for years to come will provide an easy entry point into the issue for people who are looking to repatriate items. So.
Right. So it's
almost... I was going to say, and of course, the reporting itself it will hopefully continue for a while too.
Yeah. So there's no set date on that.
Not that I'm aware of. No. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So it sounds like it's intended to be like a tool to empower these tribal nations to be able to do the work themselves. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, and not only is it helpful to see where these things ended up, but I think it's also helpful for tribes to understand what other tribal nations are dealing with the same institutions they are. University of Oklahoma is a good example. Like, the University of Oklahoma has never hired a full-time NAGPRA coordinator to repatriate items. And so a lot of that work falls on staff, not because it's a directive to the staff, but because they think it's important. But what ends up happening in those situations is that they end up relying really heavily on tribal knowledge and tribal perspectives to kind of inform. I think a lot of people in those positions are finding, when they go back to their collections, that things that were identified as culturally unidentifiable, meaning that they couldn't be linked to a present day tribe, that information does exist. It just might not be through these academic channels, right? It's like reaching out to those tribes. And, in Oklahoma, there's a lot of tribes here that have a lot of resources and a lot of manpower to put into those kind of repatriation efforts. And then there's also a lot that don't. And so I think them being able to work in conjunction with each other really expedites that process for a lot of them.
Well, yeah. Does the University of Oklahoma have a lot of items in their collection? Or?
Absolutely, they do. There's 39 tribal nations here in Oklahoma, yes. And I think all of them are represented in the collection, at least most of them. And that staff there had been pretty candid with me that before the current staff that's there now was put in place, about 10 years ago, a lot of their predecessors didn't really prioritize repatriation. It wasn't really. It either wasn't an option in their minds, or it was something that they actively worked against at a lot of these places. And so, and that's for various reasons. Some say they want to research things. I think some feel threatened, that their academic privileges are being threatened by these calls for tribal nations to return these things. And so, Oklahoma certainly has a lot. But you look in the data, Oklahoma is a really interesting case, because you can see when the current staff was hired, because the number of repatriations just skyrocket at a certain point. And when I asked staff, like, why is that? It's because they were like, well, a lot of this information to identify these items was already there. It just wasn't prioritized.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I first learned about geographic affiliation and how simple it is, and even just the access, like the federal database, like I always link that in all my stories of, here's the federal database and now the ProPublica database, but like, it's public information. You can look up any university and see exactly the human remains they have and the origin that they're geographically affiliated with. It's kind of shocking to me how accessible the information is, but it's just not literate to, or in the sphere.
A lot of cases it's just not taken seriously. Like, the geographical information will be I think a lot of researchers will interpret it like, well, this dates back 2,000 years. And do we really know who was here 2,000 years ago? Or a lot of people were nomadic through this area. But I think, one of the nice things that we're seeing with the law is that I think those scales are finally starting to tip into the favor of Native communities, where a lot of that traditional knowledge and history and culture that's kept in those nations is given kind of equal weight when it comes to these, data points like geographical location. And so, places where we're arguing that they didn't have enough information to affiliate, I'm happy to see that tribes are starting to be able to step in and fill in those gaps, for sure.
Yeah, and that brings me to the question of, what is the effect that you're seeing? I mean, I think since we started seeing this publication, this series go live in January, right?
Yes.
It's been everywhere, and all these other news sources are picking it up, and I think it's getting a lot of traction. But I wonder what you've seen from your side, and also from universities, and any policies that you've seen come out of this. I mean, what has the result been from your vantage point?
It's been really wonderful to watch, because I think this is kind of like, it reminds me of the issue of the boarding schools, is that if you grow up Native, you're aware of NAGPRA, or at least you're aware of the problem. If you're not aware of the law. And so I think, like, whenever I first started wanting to write about NAGPRA, I had one of those concerns that I have with a lot of these stories, is like, will anyone outside of our communities care? Like, will they even, because I mean, I think we've all seen this, right? You get this response from people who are like, well, they're just bones. Like, why do you care? And it's like, I mean, obviously there's a lot of like inequity. There's a lot of like really bad and ugly history wrapped up in all these things. And so that was one of my concerns, is that, am I going to put all my time and effort into this issue that I identify as important and worthwhile and fulfilling? Is anyone really going to do anything about it? And I've been really pleasantly surprised to see that that universities are taking, or people in those communities are using the data, for one, and applying it to local reporting. That's great to see. But I think the other thing that's like even more encouraging is just like the public pressure to do something about these. Like, it's not just students and faculty that care anymore, or Native people. It's like people that live in those communities around these universities and museums, I think, are starting to be vocal about how they don't like what's happening and that they want this to change. And so I guess I've just been really encouraged by that. And like, I didn't really expect NAGPRA to become like a part of the public discourse like it has. And Logan Jaffe, one of the reporters that we worked with at ProPublica, she had a story yesterday about how the state of Illinois, the legislature there, is passing some legislation to prioritize this issue. Illinois has been historically a pretty bad actor in this area. And so that's really encouraging to see that is having some impact.
And they don't have any federally recognized tribes that really exist there on paper, at least. I know they're in Chicago. Obviously, there are members of many dozens of federally recognized tribes. However, there's no federally recognized tribes that have a headquarters there in Illinois. So
yeah,
that's really the problem. Yes.
Yeah, it's just been really cool to see. And, obviously I hope that it keeps increasing. But, I also think it kind of speaks to this thing I've been noticing over the last few years, which is in these anthropological and archaeological worlds, there's a lot of people who are taking over posts at universities or starting to work more heavily in these fields that have a totally different mindset than the previous generation of archaeologists and anthropologists did about this issue. And so you're seeing this with, like, it's not just physical things like remains and items. It's with like indigenous data sets, like language and things like that. I've just met so many younger people in those fields who are really prioritizing not just giving things back, but making sure that tribal nations, communities have like direct access to this information and have like a seat at the table to say like where it should go and who should have access to it. I think that's like just really great to see. And it wasn't something that I really ever expected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing, Graham, is it seems to me like the picture that is taking shape on NAGPRA and this issue is the more attention that it gets and the more pressure that these universities and institutions are under to comply, the more they're re-inventorying. And then we see like what we saw with Dartmouth just earlier this week, where they're finding additional ancestors, and they realize that they've, undercounted the number in some cases drastically. And so it seems like it's this tunnel keeps getting longer, and it's almost like the more attention that it gets, the reality is that the further away tribal nations are from completing all, we know there are 108,000 remains at institutions, but the reality is that every year that number grows with the more attention that it gets. And more than a question, I guess it's like, how do you feel about that? Or what do you think what do you think about this tension of, the attention is good, yes, but this is the result of the attention?
Yeah, and it does. And like, I think that in a way, like the goalposts kind of keep moving a little bit, because it's frustrating, I think, when you look through like Federal Register data, stuff like that, and you look at these entry points for like, particularly for, I mean, this happens with human remains a lot too, but I see it a lot in things with like dealing with regalia and jewelry, is that, it'll say, there's 39 items that we want to repatriate and there's 5 that are missing. And they almost always happen to be like turquoise jewelry and things like that. And so like, I think that for a long, long time, people in these institutions were able to treat these things with like, not just disrespect, but like to like commodify them or like to steal them. And like, mishandle them, lose them within the institution, or someone takes them on loan and there's not proper paperwork for that. Like, I feel comfortable saying that for a lot of major institutions, those days are gone. Like that is no longer acceptable. And people aren't going to let you get away with it anymore. But I think probably what we're going to start seeing a lot is a lot of these institutions that don't receive federal funding, that aren't required by the law to comply, are probably going to start doing it on their own. And it's not, and I think in a lot of those cases, it's not because they don't want to, it's just because they don't have the staff or expertise. I mean, if you're a small county museum and you have 4 or 5 staff members, I doubt you have a NAGPRA coordinator, right? Or I doubt you have an attorney on staff who like understands the intricacies of the law. And so I think probably what we're going to be seeing over the next few years, as long as the pressure continues, is that these institutions are probably going to be reaching out to the federal NAGPRA office, to tribes, to ask for guidance and help. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of places that aren't required by law to comply are going to feel compelled to reach out and try to get these remains and items back to where they belong. Because, you know, you just look through the documents about how these things were acquired. And I mean, I think it's safe to assume that most of them were acquired under inequitable circumstances. And a lot of time it was just outright theft. Right. And so, I really do hope that we're seeing that. And I think it's also encouraging to see that the federal government wants to like reshape the law in a way that makes it work better. So.
Yeah. And what kind of surprised me about the Dartmouth story was the fact that Dartmouth has prided itself as working really closely with Indigenous people for the last 2 or 3 decades. So that was really surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of universities that, to that point too, I think there's a lot of universities that say that, right? Mm-hmm. That say that we take great care, we're really working hard on this. But if you go and you look in the data, it's kind of easy to see that there really hasn't been a lot of movement there. And so that's one of the things that I really like about the data set, is that, the receipts are there. And so if it doesn't matter what they're saying if they're not doing it, right? And now you can check up on that. So yeah.
To that point, Graham, like it seems to me that being steeped in the world of NAGPRA and what you're saying, like growing up as an Indigenous person and having stake in NAGPRA in that capacity, but then also as a reporter, not a lot probably surprises you. I hear this a lot from folks that work in the realm of NAGPRA as well, that, they're not surprised when Dartmouth comes out with this announcement. They're not surprised when they see this new notice of inventory completion. But I wonder if there was anything that did surprise you, and if there was, how you're able to communicate that to your community, your your friends at the dinner table. Like, I wonder what that conversation is like.
I think one of the things that, I don't know if it surprised me, but I mean, it makes sense. But I think one of the things that I learned the most covering this story was just like how vocal Indigenous activists had been for decades about the necessity of this law. I mean, I think you could say that about any law that gives Indigenous people rights or a seat at the table, is that it didn't come just because the federal government decided one day we should do this. It was because of years and years of Indigenous activism and advocacy work. But I think like really just explaining to people that this isn't just a law that's about doing what's right. It's like, this is a human rights violation, right? And I think being able to talk about it in those ways, and I think it has been illuminating for a lot of people, but also like just calling it on its face what it is, which is it's grave robbing, right? Like using those words, I think is really powerful, because this is the kind of work that for generations, like people built careers off of, and like they're built their wealth and their reputation off of, and had buildings named after them for doing this kind of work. It was seen as a long time for something that was, like vital. I've talked to people who are trying to repatriate regalia that was stolen, and the justification years later that anthropologists would give for stealing it was like, well, I stole it because I was afraid that it wouldn't be documented, or that it would die, or it would get destroyed. And it's like, it's not your decision to make, No. And so I like kind of gets back to that point I was making earlier, that like the mentality in those industries, I think, is really changing. But I think just pointing that out to people, that like, we really need to be rethinking like how we approach these fields of study, and like asking ourselves not just like scientific questions, but ethical ones too. And not to say that they didn't ask a lot of those questions in certain regards previously, but I think that's just become such a bigger part of the discussion. And so, I think one of the things that was kind of surprising to me, now that I think about it, is like just that justification. Like California is a really great example. There are so many people who worked in those fields in the 1900s, whose whole mission was to document these Indians and these communities, because quote unquote, like they're dying, they're extinct, or like they no longer exist. Well, at the same time, those communities were literally like fighting for their very existence, for their basic human rights and dignity. It kind of makes you wonder, like, did these people actively ignore these communities, or did they really just not understand that they were still very much alive? And so, unfortunately, a lot of these people aren't alive anymore today to ask them how they came to those conclusions. But I did find that a little surprising, which is, really saying something, because I think, you expect that, but just to see it in paper, it was a little shocking, those justifications for taking those things.
Yeah, interesting. I can also relate to what you're saying about like calling things what they are. And I think in journalism school, we learn to really step away from imparting our own opinions or judgments on things. But like, you're right. Like I remember when I had this moment at the repatriation conference in Michigan this year, like everyone was calling it a human rights law. And like, yeah. So now I started writing it. Like, it's human rights legislation. That is what it is. That's a fact. Yeah. But it's interesting that, my inclination as a journalist is to be like, wait, can I say this without attributing it to someone?
Yeah. No, I think that's like one of the most fulfilling parts of covering Indian country, is that, you can call things what they are, right? And speak to people in a way that they're not used to being, like, with real authority. Because, I think there's a reason why people don't recognize genocide as genocide, because they've been taught a narrative that counters that purposefully, right? Or it's been admitted purposely from your public school education. And so I grew up in Oklahoma, and the only thing I learned about my people in my history classes in high school was like what the Trail of Tears was like. My Oklahoma history class in high school started with the land run, basically. And so it doesn't surprise me that this is new to a lot of people, but it gives us an opportunity to, like, I think, be just honest and direct in our reporting, for sure.
Well, thank you for your work on it, because it's such important work. Tell me this, at NBC, how receptive are they when you bring the Indigenous stories to them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question. One of the things I tell people, I used to run the trainings for NAGPRA. We still do them a lot. I don't do them as much personally anymore, but we would run these trainings for newsrooms and kind of give them a primer on how to cover Indian country and tribal governments and things like that. And one of the things I would often tell reporters is, like, if you're new to this beat and your paper has never really covered this community in any depth or any real, like, fairness, you're not just a reporter, you're a diplomat in this situation. You have to be ready to apologize for that, or at least acknowledge it, right? Like, it's probably not your fault directly, but I think in order to build trust, you need to at least acknowledge it. And so I think, I expect that kind of level of understanding in most places where I've worked. But NBC really, like, offered me an opportunity to just cover it exclusively, and which is, something that I have been doing for a long time and really wanted to continue doing. And I hesitate to say this a lot, because I don't want to step on anyone's, I don't want to forget anyone or diminish anyone's work that I'm not thinking of. But to my knowledge, I'm the only person at one of the major news organizations that has this beat full time. And so anytime I do have an opportunity to talk to an administrator or someone in charge of editorial at one of our competitors, I always like to remind them that, like, I would be happy to have competition from you. I think you should be actively seeking out people to cover this beat. It's important. And, it's always shocking to me when places that cover politics on like a state level, for instance, don't cover the tribal nations that are in their areas. Like you look at where I live in Oklahoma, like my tribe, the Cherokee Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, the Choctaw Nation, like these are major economic forces in the region, right? Like, and they have like major like resources and time and money to put into lobbying efforts, not just on the state legislature, but at Capitol Hill. And it's like, and these, by the way, these are governments that aren't subject to open records laws, right? And so I just really think it behoves reporters to be paying attention to them. And so, when NBC offered me that opportunity, I was just really thrilled to take it. And I've gotten to do some really fun reporting, and I think introduce some concepts to NBC readers that they were unaware of, like Indigenous data sovereignty or the, NAGPRA, for instance. And so it's been a lot of fun. I've had a really good time doing it.
Yeah, as I've said, it's such important work too. And as you well know, oftentimes we have to even basically explain our existence. Like, people will say obnoxious things like, well, we thought we killed most of the natives. You're still around,
I like Dr. Twyla Baker. One of the things that she says, and I don't know if this phrase originated with her or if I just heard it from her, was like translation exhaustion. Like, by the time I explain to you what sovereignty is, I don't want to have a conversation about whatever it was we were going to get into about sovereignty. So, I think that's a problem that a lot of Native journalists have, right? Is like just getting an editor who isn't from a Native community to understand that there's a story there, period, right?
Correct.
But luckily, like I have editors who trust my judgment and my expertise in the area, and so I've had a lot of luck. So
and I'm happy to see like MSNBC's using Alyssa London more and more. So.
Alyssa's great.
Yeah, she is great. Well, Jenna, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, I think my last question, Graham, is about just what tribal nations and citizens can do and how they can use your data set that you helped create to hold governments and institutions and museums accountable for returning their ancestors and having it be expeditious or as expeditious as possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I think one of the things that I've seen that's been highly effective is just using the data to apply pressure to that institution. So like, even if you don't have a TIPO or a tribal historic preservation office with your tribe, or, you don't have any way to like navigate those channels within the university or the institution, like you can still use that data to ask them, like, what are you doing? Like, when are you going to give these things back? Like, who's in charge of that work? And like, I think that like, you see this a lot with like Native students at some of these universities will take the data and just basically say like, what gives? And I really do think that like that puts pressure on those institutions to actually do something about it. And the other thing, that I would really love to see is like, if you're a Native person trying to get something back from your community, your family, like, and you're hitting these walls, like reach out to us as reporters. We have the time and energy and the want to like help you apply that pressure. Especially if it's a, egregious case, which there, as you both know, are many. And so
we'll have to look far these days.
And I think it's kind of like Standing Rock in a way. Like, I think before Standing Rock, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of problematic coverage around Standing Rock, but like, I do think Standing Rock kind of changed the landscape. I think it showed a lot of these publications that there is merit in covering these stories.
Yes.
And if you had been the reporter who had the foresight to cover Standing Rock before it got violent, like you probably would have had one hell of a story, right? And so, like I just keep telling a lot of these editors at these places that like the more you cover these communities, the stronger your newsroom is, the stronger your coverage is. Like, that's how you do real accountability impact work. And I think we as reporters, we pride ourselves on covering these communities that are underserved. And, I can think of a few more underserved communities than some of these tribal communities that are dealing with these issues. So all that is to say, I would, I bring it up too, because I know a lot of people in these tribal communities have a healthy distrust of the media, and it's warranted. It's earned. And that's why I was saying earlier, to be a diplomat. And so I think the more that people in those communities feel comfortable coming to us telling us these things, like hopefully the more that we can see some impact and some change. So
yeah. Absolutely. The other thing I heard Kelly Mosteller, the new Harvard, she's working at Harvard and she's helping with their NAGPRA compliance. And she's like, it requires a level of shaming these institutions as well. Like, unfortunately, that's the reality. And I'm hearing something similar from that as well. Just from it being in the media in general is shaming this reputation, you know, but that's a powerful tool.
Well, thank you, Graham and Jenna, for joining us today on Native Bidaské. And to our viewers, we say Chimigwich for tuning in, and we hope you have a safe week. And tune in next week for another edition of Native Bidaské. Chimigwich.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chimigwech.